Hello, and thanks for joining the webinar. So let's wait a minute for everyone to join. And while we are waiting, it would be interesting to find out where are you joining this webinar from, just to see where is this webinar heard. So I'm calling from Zagreb, from Croatia. How about you? Send me a message through chat or through this Q&A's panel, just to see where you're calling from. Yeah. In any case, while we are waiting for your answers, just a couple of notes. First, we are recording this webinar. So you'll be able to watch the recording after we complete the webinar. At the end of the webinar, I'll explain you how to access this recording of the webinar. And also you'll be able to download this presentation deck. Also after the webinar, I'll also explain you how to access this PDF presentation deck from the webinar. Okay, great. Yeah, okay, I see some people already saying where they're from. So Nigeria, great. Also Nashville, Tennessee, United States. New Bremen, Ohio. Okay, great. So I'm glad that people from lots of continents are actually presented here at the webinar today. Okay, Sweden, great. Europe, Germany. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. Great. Okay, so let me start with the webinar. So welcome to this webinar today, the basics of risk assessment and treatment according to ISO 27001. My name is 𝗹𝗲𝗴𝗶𝗀𝗁, and I'm the main ISO 27001 NIS2 and DORA expert at 𝘹𝗲𝗴𝗶𝘀. And 𝘹𝗲𝗴𝗶𝗀 is a company that makes compliance easy to understand and simple to use. This webinar today will be streamed through Zoom, also through LinkedIn live events and YouTube live. And it will last approximately 50 to 60 minutes. And it really depends on how many questions you will have. And by all means, please do ask as many questions as you want, because the more this webinar is interactive, the more interesting it will be. So you can ask questions during the webinar using this Q&A pane, but also you can and you can actually send those questions during the webinar, so during my presentation, and I'll try to answer those right away. But I'll also answer all of the questions, remaining questions, in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So if you want, send your questions even before. Good. Now let's move on to the next slide. Good. So, I mean, why is this risk management topic important? First of all, basically, most companies that I've worked with don't really understand the importance of this risk management, and basically they take it, too lightly, too easily, and basically they don't prepare. And the consequence of this is that basically their whole implementation of this ISMS doesn't really work very well, and so that they are not actually fulfilling one of the main purposes here, and really this is to reduce the risk. So really, if you want to implement this ISO 27001 generally in a proper way, then this risk management, meaning risk assessment and treatment, also has to be implemented, I would say, properly. Second important thing, sorry, so what I will explain today in this webinar is what are the requirements of ISO 27001 for risk assessment and treatment, because there is also a lot of, let's say, unknowns around this, what the standard does and what the standard does not require. So I'll explain you, what you must have and what you may have, so what is optional. And I'll also give you a couple of ideas on how to do it in practice. And basically this webinar today is intended for beginners. So I explain some very basics about risk assessment and treatment. Basically it's intended for companies that go for ISO 27001 for the first time. Now, if you're, let's say, a more experienced consultant for 27001, then you might, watch some of my other webinars or other trainings where I go more into depth on risk management. But here, when it comes to, let's say, this webinar, I'm more, let's say, going for beginners and explain some basic things. Okay, now one of the main points today is that risk management is really I would say, it's not really the first step in ISO 27001. There are some other steps that you have to go through before, but it is the first bigger step in the implementation, and I would say the one that you will probably spend something like from a couple of weeks maybe to a couple of months, depending on the size of your company, and it is the probably the most complex step in your implementation. And why is this so important? It's important because basically this risk assessment and treatment determine everything else that you will be doing in the implementation afterwards. And I'll explain this in a couple of slides. But the point is that whatever you find out, so basically ISO 27000 works like this. It doesn't prescribe what kind of controls you have to implement, but it does tell you that you have to perform risk assessment, and based on this you have to define treatment, meaning you have to find what are the controls or safeguards to decrease these risks. Okay, so basically it tells you that you have to do thoroughly this risk assessment in order to find out what can go wrong, and then figure out how to fix these risks using the safeguards from the Annex A. So this is at the core of the standard, and this is why this risk management is so important, because it does really determine everything else, everything that comes afterwards in the implementation. Okay, so let's see the agenda briefly. And by the way, I'll go through this agenda, and if you have any other topics that you find interesting, let me know through the chat window. So if you want me to focus on any of these topics that I go through in this agenda, or some other topics, let me know, and then I'll try to focus on these things during the webinar. Okay, so I'll go very briefly through this, why is this risk management important. Then I'll show you the process of risk management, so basically the 5 steps as as they are needed according to 27001. I'll also show you these elements of risk assessment. Again, there are 5 elements that are required according to ISO 27001. And then I'll show you the examples on how to identify assets and vulnerabilities and threats, and also how to assess impact and likelihood. So basically these are, again, I would say the most important steps and elements on how you assess the risks. And then at the end, I'll also go through these 4 options for treating the risks. Yeah, I'll show you just a couple of examples on how you can actually treat or decrease the risks once you identify them. And of course, at the end, we'll have this questions and answers session. Okay, so why is this risk management important? So as I already explained in the introduction, basically the ISO 27001 is, I would say, a framework that defines how you manage information security. Okay. And when you think about it, there are 2 very important elements. So one is this risk management, as I explained, which basically determines which kind of controls you need to implement. So these 2 elements are, of course, crucial for overall ISO 27000 information security management. There is also a 3rd element. This is measurement. So basically, once you determine through risk assessment and treatment which controls you need, then you implement them basically through your implementation phase, and then you actually have to monitor and measure if you are achieving your objectives with the implementation of these controls. So this is why this measurement is also a 3rd crucial, I would say, element when managing information security according to ISO 27001. Here in this slide, I've also written which standards are focused on each of these areas. So overall information security management, this is ISO 27001, which defines the ISMS, Information Security Management Systems. Then you have risk management, and this is where ISO 27005 is the most useful because it focuses specifically, on how to perform risk assessment and treatment. For implementation of controls, there is ISO 27002, which suggests for each of these controls, each of these 93 controls, how you can actually implement them in your company, and also 27004, which suggests how to set the objectives and how to measure the fulfillment of these objectives. In any case, ISO 27001 is mandatory if you want to get certified against these standards, but if you want to, these other standards that I mentioned, 27005 and 2 and 4, they are not mandatory, okay? So if you want only to implement 27001 in your company and you don't want to do this as a consultant, then you do not need these other standards. However, if you are a consultant or if you are doing security, for a living, if you're, let's say, CISO or something like this, then you should, I would say, probably purchase these other standards as well and study them, because they provide you with additional know-how, additional information. Okay, we'll send you now links to two articles. So one is this how to structure the documents for ISO 27001 Annex A. So you can basically, this is of course related to this second element that I mentioned here, and also the other link is how to perform monitoring and measurement in ISO 27001. I know this is not really the topic of today's webinar, but I just wanted to provide you with these links so that you can actually learn more about these other aspects of ISO 27001. And by the way, if you joined the webinar through Zoom or through YouTube Live, you will be able to click these links and open the links directly. But if you joined through LinkedIn, then because of some limitations in LinkedIn, you actually cannot click these links and open them right away. So the workaround for this is that you simply copy this URL and then paste it into your browser, and you'll be able to open these links. Very well. Now let's move on to the next slides. And this is about what is this process? What are these 5 steps that you need to take if you want to be compliant with 27001 risk management? The first one is that you need to define the risk assessment methodology. Okay, so basically this is a document which defines the rules on how you actually perform risk assessment. Because if you didn't have these kind of rules, then you would have first of all, no one would know in your company how to perform risk assessment or treatment, and second, everyone would do it in a different way. So you would have a very I would say uncomparable results, very diverse results, and simply these results wouldn't be I would say usable. In this basically risk assessment methodology, you define which kind of method you will use for listing the risks. Is this going to be asset-based risk assessment, or process-based, or something like this? What are the scales that you will be using for assessment? These kind of things. So basically, this is what you have to write in the methodology. And I'll come to these elements in a couple of slides and show you what are basically the options that you can play around when writing the methodology. Okay, risk assessment is where you actually have to list all the potential risks and assess how big they are, how important they are, how dangerous they are. Okay, so basically this assessment has two, I would say, sub-steps. One is to list the risks, and the other one is to really judge how big they are. The next step is to do the so-called risk treatment. This is where you actually have to take all the unacceptable risks and then find how you're going to manage, how you're going to handle these risks that are too high to be accepted. And by the way, we'll also share with you this link to this article called ISO 27001 Risk Assessment, Treatment and Management, the Complete Guide. And there you will find everything that I'm speaking about today in this webinar. You will find also in the details in this article. So if you want to dig into deeper, you can actually take a look at this article. Anyway, the fourth step is to create this statement of applicability. And basically this is, I would say, a unique document to ISO 27001. I didn't see that it exists in some other security frameworks. So basically it's well, a document that lists all the 93 controls from the Annex A. And then for each of them, you have to define which of these controls is applicable and which controls are not applicable. And you basically define this primarily based on the risk assessment and treatment results. So if you define that you have to treat certain risks using certain controls, then this is basically the input into your statement of applicability. And this is where then you say, okay, we need to apply this, I don't know, control XYZ, because there are some risks which require this kind of control to be implemented. Okay. In the statement of applicability, you also define what is the status of each control. You could also define, you know, what is the method of the implementation and so on. So it becomes a very handy document because it, you know, summarizes your whole, I would say, security profile, your statuses for each control, and also how you implement each and every control. So it becomes really a central document in your ISMS. And then finally, you have to write this risk treatment plan. And basically this is, I would say, an implementation plan for your controls. This is where you actually list only the controls that are not implemented yet. So when you actually take a step back and look at the statement of applicability, let's say that in this statement of applicability, out of these 93 controls, you marked, let's say, 85 as applicable, okay? And then out of this 85, you marked, let's say, 60 as already implemented. Because, I mean, most of these controls are common sense, like, you know, antiviruses, you know, classification of data, backing up the data, this kind of thing. So most of the controls you will mark as already implemented because you probably already performed them before your ISO 27001 project. So let's say this is 60, however, you marked 85 as applicable, so this means that you have 25 to implement yet, okay? And these 25 that are not implemented yet are actually the ones that you have to list in the risk treatment plan. And then in the risk treatment plan, you define who needs to implement these controls, meaning who is in charge, what kind of resources are needed, what are the deadlines, these kind of things. So in reality, this risk treatment plan is an implementation plan for your controls. Okay, we'll share also with you now this link to this step-by-step explanation of ISO 27001 risk management. So it's also one material that could be very useful for you when you think about risk management. So you'll be able to actually it's a free download. Anyway, when you click the link, you will be able to open this. Okay, now what are these elements of risk assessment? So there are 5 elements that are mandatory according to ISO 27001. And you actually have to include these 5 elements into your risk assessment methodology. You have to describe in your methodology how you're going to define these elements. Now, you could add some other elements as well, but this means that basically your risk assessment will be more complex than needed, right? So if you want to go for the bare minimum, then these are the things that, you know, I'll show you actually what is this bare minimum that you need to have if you want to be compliant. Okay, the first element that you need to have is risk identification, meaning you have to define how you're going to list the risks, okay? The most popular method is this asset-based risk assessment, where you simply list all the assets and then vulnerabilities and threats. But there is also, you know, process-based. You know, there are some other methods on how you could list the risks. The next element that is mandatory is risk owner. So for each risk, you have to define who is the owner, meaning who is the person who is responsible for actually handling this particular risk. Typically, this is, you know, a person who is, I would say, the closest to this asset, who knows this asset the best. And then this is usually the person that is the risk owner. So I don't know, for you know, if you have a physical server in a data room, then probably this will be, I don't know, some IT administrator who is in charge of this and who is the asset owner. However, if this is let's say some key, application that you have, software that you're running in your company, then it might be actually the CTO or someone like this. Or if this is, I don't know, an human resources payroll application, then you might have actually the head of human resources department as the as the risk owner. Now, we'll also send you now a link to this article called Risk Owners versus Asset Owners, so that you get a little bit a better idea on who these risk owners might be and how is this different from asset owners. Okay, the next mandatory element is that you define the level of impact. So impact is basically how big the consequences will be if there is an incident, right? So you have to assess the impact, and you also have to assess the level of likelihood. Okay, and then impact and likelihood are basically the two elements which determine the level of risk. So how big the risk is. Again, this is based on two main inputs: impact and likelihood. Now, when it comes to risk identification, as I mentioned, there is this method of listing the assets and then threats and vulnerabilities. So this is so-called asset-based risk assessment. It is not mandatory. However, it's still, I would say, dominant. So I would say that at least 50% of companies are using this asset-based risk assessment. Why is it dominant? Well, first of all, it's used for decades. Second, I would say certification auditors prefer this method. So if you go for certification, then I mean, if your company goes for certification, you'll find it easier to deal with auditors if you use this method. And also, if you are based in Europe, if your company is based in Europe, and if you have to comply with, let's say, DORA, the EU cybersecurity regulation, or with NIS2, which is again EU cybersecurity directive, they're also going in the direction of asset-based risk assessment. So, there are several, I would say, reasons why this asset-based is kind of preferred one, even though it's not a mandatory. Okay, and then in the next couple of slides, I'll show you some examples of asset-based risk assessment. Now, the fifth mandatory element is this determining the level of risk. And the standard doesn't really say how you determine the level of risk, but the most common methods are that you actually multiply impact and likelihood. So let's say that your impact is, let's say, level 3, and that your likelihood is level 4, then 3 times 4 would be 12. You would have the risk of the level 12. Or the second method is that you add impact and likelihood. So 3 plus 4 would be 7. Okay. Now, none of these methods are, again, mandatory. From the, let's say, precision point of view, again, it's none of these methods are better or worse. So whatever you choose here is going to be fine. Now, before moving into onto the next slide, just to mention, again, you can add some other, let's say, elements into this risk assessment, like, asset value, or, the value of vulnerability, the value of threat, but all of these elements are not needed. So you could add them, but, beware. Each element that you add into the risk methodology, the more time you will need actually to perform the risk assessment. And are you going to be more precise in this risk assessment? I'm not sure. It's really a matter of a discussion here. So the point being, if you're a smaller company, don't go beyond this minimum. If you're, I don't know, larger financial organization, then yes, then you might actually add some more complexity here to try to actually get some, I would say, more precise results with this kind of risk assessment. Okay, Kuram is asking what other options of risk assessment are available other than the asset-based. So process-based risk assessment, there are some other methods, but I would say process-based risk assessment is something that happens, that you sometimes you can actually see. Okay, good. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So let's go to some examples of risk assessment, right? So let's say an asset could be a hardware, right? You have physical server, you could have laptops, desktop computers, smartphones, I don't know, physical keys, these kind of things. You could have, of course, software, right? You could have information in various forms. So you could have databases, which are, of course, in digital form. You could have paper information. I mean, yes, still some companies are still using paper. If nothing else, to jot down some ideas, right? So if your CEO uses the paper pad, to write down some notes, then it becomes a very, I would say, I mean, sometimes it could be something that is very, confidential, something that is very important. So, even those paper as a media can be sensitive, if nothing else. Infrastructure, so, electricity, buildings, I don't know, air conditioning, these kind of things. People, of course, are a very important asset, from the information security point of view. So basically, when you list assets, you have to list all of these types of assets if you want to have a comprehensive risk assessment. Okay, some questions coming in from Matt. Do risk owner always need to be an individual? Can it be a team or of people or department? Yes, this can be a department as well. And I understand that sometimes an IT department needs to be an owner of, let's say, I don't know, laptops or something like this, which is fine. But do try to individualize this responsibility if possible. Okay, especially when it comes to some more critical assets. It's whenever you have, I would say, shared responsibility, then basically you very often come to the point of no one actually being responsible. So the more critical the asset is, try to find an individual who is responsible. Good. Kwame is asking, is there any policy or rule guiding the determination of risk impact value in the equation given? First of all, ISO 27001 does not specify how this needs to be, calculated or anything like this. So you need to define your own document. This is usually called risk assessment methodology, and in this document you define these rules, these policies on, how you determine the impact, how you determine what scales you're using, and so on. Good. Yeah, let's go for the next slide, and this is around vulnerabilities, right? So now you're connecting the relevant vulnerabilities for your assets, okay? So if you have a physical asset in terms of, let's say, a room or a physical server, then a lack of fire extinguishing system could be a vulnerability. So what is really the vulnerability? Vulnerability is basically, I would say, the state of these assets which enables the potential problem to happen, right? So if your, let's say, server room does not have a fire extinguishing system, this is a vulnerability because this fact that there is no such system actually enables a fire to break out, right? So vulnerability is basically somehow the reason, so to say, that a threat could actually materialize. Okay, lack of antivirus software. This is related, let's say, to a software or database or these kind of assets. A lack of business continuity plans. This could be, let's say, related to physical assets, again, like your buildings or something like this. So basically, if you have a physical infrastructure and the vulnerability could be that you are not prepared, you don't have any plans on how to react in some kind of case of some kind of a disaster. Lack of incident response procedures. Again, this could be, let's say, related to some of your physical assets and so on. Obsolete equipment. This is related to your, let's say, equipment, so hardware. Hardware. These kind of things. So this would be the example of a vulnerability. Lack of replacement. This is a typical vulnerability related to people as assets, right? So let's say that you have one person who is the only one in the company who knows, I don't know, some things. Then it's if you have no one to replace this person, then this is obviously a vulnerability, something that enables a risk, a problem to happen. Now, threats are again related to both assets and relevant vulnerabilities. Okay, again, if you have a physical asset and there is no fire suppression system, then a fire is a threat that can happen because of this particular combination of asset and vulnerability. Same thing with the next one, and this is a virus. Again, if you have an asset, let's say your software, the vulnerability is that you do not have antivirus software, then obviously virus is a threat that can materialize because of this combination of asset and vulnerability. Earthquake, again, this is related to, let's say, your physical infrastructure. The let's say a vulnerability here would be that you do not have any business continuity plans, and earthquake is a threat. Bomb threat, again, this is related to assets and that you don't have some incident response procedures. Equipment malfunction, if you have you know, like I don't know, some kind of specific specialized equipment, and then that this is a vulnerability is that this is obsolete, right? It's, I don't know, 15 or 20 years old, then a threat is a malfunction. And again, related to people, if you have asset is your, let's say, some key employee, vulnerability is that this is the only person that knows something and there is no replacement for this person, then this combination of asset and vulnerability actually enables threat to materialize, so keep people leaving the company. Okay, so these are only some examples of assets and threats and vulnerabilities, and I mean, you know, this is something that is very often you know, multiplying, because when you think about it, there are so many, you know, assets in a company, and then obviously so many threats and vulnerabilities. So it's very often it's hard actually to list all of these things and actually to come up with I would say some comprehensive way to listing all of these. Now we'll send you now a link to an article which lists threats and vulnerabilities, so you can have actually a look at this. I would say this is a kind of a smaller checklist of threats and vulnerabilities that can help you out, but I also share now the screen with you to show you how actually this can be done by using a software. So this will be, let me show you now, our software called 𝗏𝗏𝗴𝗶. So basically, for those of you who already use 𝗏𝗏𝗴𝗶, you know, this is the software focused on ISO 27001. When you open this software, then you actually see this list of implementation steps for ISO 27001. Now, I'm not going to explain these steps, but I'll show you how this risk register works. So basically, once you open this risk register, it actually takes you through all of these steps that you have to perform. So you go from listing the assets and then vulnerabilities and then going for threats, then evaluation. This is basically impact and likelihood. Then you have to review all these things, and then you have to define the treatment, meaning, you know, the controls and so on. So in this step of you know, listing the assets, you already have here a kind of catalog of all the potential assets that you have in your company, and of course you can click you know, any of these assets that you have, and then you simply click next and then the system automatically lists what are the potential vulnerabilities for each of these assets, and then you simply click those that are applicable to you, and then you simply go next, and there you see actually the threats which are related to this specific combination of assets and vulnerabilities. Okay, so basically I'm showing you this just for you to realize that this kind of a complex step of doing the risk assessment can be, you know, improved. I mean, you can speed it up by using this kind of a tool. Of course, we are not the only ones that provide this kind of software. You know, there are many other providers of this kind of risk register. But the point is, you know, it's recommendable actually that you use something like this to speed the things up. Now, since we are already at this screen of 𝗏𝗏𝗴𝗶, what is good is that once it's actually highly automated. So once you complete this risk assessment, it will send the information from the risk register directly into statement of applicability, and actually help you fill out this statement of applicability, because if you remember, this is something that this is the main input into the statement of applicability. And it also later on has this screen about audit and evidence. So Conformio actually helps you, list all the documents and write all of these documents that are needed as part of the implementation. And it also helps you with, defining which clauses, what is your kind of a gap analysis, and it shows you exactly how far did you go with the implementation that relates to each and every clause, each and every control. Now, since this is basically a new account, nothing is implemented, so basically it says that you're not ready for an audit. But as you go through the implementation, most of these things become green, and then you know exactly how far did you get it. It helps you visually understand how ready you are. Okay, now let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so after you complete this assets and threats and vulnerabilities, then you actually go for assessment of impact and likelihood. Of course, there is also a part in Conformia which helps you with this, but I'm not going to go back to Conformia now. So basically, you need to use some kind of assessment scales, and basically the scales could be as simple as low, medium, and high. So you can use these simple scales, especially if you are a smaller company, or if you, let's say, want to be more precise, you can use scales from, let's say, 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. So if you're using, I don't know, a scale from 1 to 5, then this would be, 1 would be that very low, 2 would be low, 3 would be medium, 4 would be high, and then 5 would be very high impact and likelihood. So again, the standard doesn't say which kind of scales you have to use, but you have to be aware that the smaller the scales, the actually quicker the assessment. Because if you ask these asset owners or risk owners to actually assess the level of impact and likelihood, if they have only low, medium, and high, it will be quicker for them to assess this as opposed to, let's say, giving them the scale of, let's say, 1 to 10. It's going to be harder and not so fast. So the point is, depending on the size of your company, you should actually consider the level of impact and the level of scales. Okay, good. Yeah, let's move on now to the next slide. So how does this risk assessment actually table look like in the end? So what is the kind of an output from this process? And basically you can see this in the screen now. So you have this the asset, right? And then you have the owner, then you have the threat and vulnerability, level of impact, level of likelihood, and ultimately the level of risk. Okay, so this is basically the risk assessment output, whether you're doing this through an Excel sheet or if you're using some kind of risk register like you've seen in Conformia. So let's just go through this briefly. So let's say the asset is a physical server, and then you have the owner, risk owner is the administrator, and then you have the electricity outage as a threat, and vulnerability would be that there is no UPS, there is no uninterruptible power supply, right? It's something that, threat is pretty, I would say, obvious here. Vulnerability, if you're not using UPS, well, this is something that could become a problem. Let's say in this case that the impact is, let's say, on the scale from 1 to 5, that the impact is 4, the likelihood, let's say, that it's 2. And then in this case, if you use addition as a method, then you have this 4 plus 2 equals 6, okay? The same asset, let's say the threat is fire, vulnerability, no fire extinguisher, then impact in this case could be higher, 5, likelihood 3, 5 plus 3 is 8. As you can see, you can actually, for one asset, you typically have multiple threats and vulnerabilities, meaning multiple risks related to one single asset. And it goes on and on. Let's say contract, let's say this is a paper-based document in a physical format. So owner, let's say managing director, access by unauthorized persons, the contract is left on the table. Impact likelihood 4 plus 4, 8, I don't know, again, fire, no fire protection, 4 plus 3, 7, and so on. So this is how you move on and do your risk assessment. Now you'll notice that the first row here is a level of 6, and this is in green, and then you have these other risks in red color. Now, why is this? Because you have to determine in your risk assessment methodology what is the acceptable level of risk. Meaning, you have to say, you need to find a way to distinguish between, let's say, smaller and not so important risks and those higher risks. And this is important because you're not going to be able to treat all of the risks, because this would be really too much, too expensive. And if a risk is really low, why would then you spend effort or money to treat it, right? So you need to put some kind of a threshold, and this threshold is basically the acceptable level of risk. In this case, this hypothetical company has defined that the acceptable level of risk is 6, so 6 or lower is acceptable, whereas 7 or higher is not acceptable. And this is why these 7, 8, and 8 are not acceptable, meaning that you actually move into the treatment phase only the unacceptable risks, okay? So the acceptable risks are not treated, whereas unacceptable risks go a step further and they are treated. Okay, now let's see a couple of questions that came in. Hugo is asking, is there a reason why you assess vulnerabilities before threats? Some organizations threats first and then vulnerability later. It's basically a matter of approach. There is no particular reason why you do it. Sometimes this is done, so asset and vulnerability, because you relate vulnerability directly to the asset. Because again, you can't have vulnerability independent from the asset. So sometimes, especially if you're using a software, it's easier actually to connect the vulnerability to the asset, and then based on this combination, you actually see what threats are relevant for these combinations, because you're not going to list a threat if there is no vulnerability, right? So this is basically the idea here. Grace is asking, are there cases where you have to use high scales? I'm not sure what you mean by high scales, but if you use larger scales, then you actually need to, again, smaller scales are typically used for smaller companies with, let's say, lower risk profile. If you're a larger, I would say, critical infrastructure organization or financial institution, then you will probably use some bigger scales. Okay, Nana is asking, can you send direct link to Conformio? Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot to send this. You'll see now in the chat window this link to open a Conformio. And by the way, you can actually go for a free trial of Conformio, 14-day free trial, and you can play around with the risk register and do whatever you think you want to do with this. Okay, Mohammed is asking, can exist many vulnerabilities for the same assets, for example, no UPS or batteries problem? Yes, of course. In most cases, you will have one asset and then several vulnerabilities, and for each vulnerability, several threats. So ultimately, you will have one asset, but you will have, let's say, 10, 15, 20 risks for one asset. Okay, Kuram is asking, sometimes the vulnerability is not due to an asset, but due to the process. For example, where you locate your equipment. I'm not sure if I follow this, but I mean, yes, of course, you can also use this process-based risk assessment and then try to follow this. But when you think about it, this asset-based approach is usually very good, because it's you can really cover all the angles that you want to protect there. Haitam is asking, is there a reason why advisor calculate the residual risks automatically? Is that not a limitation? So in Conformio, the residual risk is calculated automatically, and by the way, this is something that you must do according to the standard. And I mean, a large majority of our clients are actually happy with this, because they actually don't have to do this step on their own manually. So I think that this is a good feature. I'm not sure if there is some other, let's say, way to. Of course, if you think that there should be some other approach, let me know. Especially, you can send me an email and we can discuss this also through email. Monica is asking, should we conduct before the risk assessment a gap analysis, or this is not necessary? So gap analysis is not mandatory. It's not something that is required by the standard, and I've seen usually larger companies doing the gap assessment at the beginning of the project. So not related to the risk assessment, it's something that is done as part of, let's say, preparation for the project. Steve is asking, conformity specifically for ISO 27001 can it be used for NIST? So no, it's conformity is currently only for 27001. We are planning to actually open it up for some other frameworks, but currently it's only for 27. Good. Now, a couple of questions coming on in more, but I have to move on with the next slide, and I'll cover these questions later on in the Q&A. So once you define this threshold of unacceptable risks, then you actually move on into this risk treatment phase, and there you have typically 4 options. These are not all the options, but these are the most common ones. So of course, the apply appropriate controls, this is the most used. This is where actually you select one or more of these controls from the Annex A. And by the way, you don't have to limit yourself only to Annex A controls. You can also go for controls from other standards, like from, let's say, NIST cybersecurity framework or some others. Of course, if your company also needs to comply with I don't know, NIST 2, or for especially with DORA, then you can also use some of these security measures from these frameworks and so on. The other way to handle risk is basically to accept it, right? But basically, if you want to accept a high risk, then you need to do it according to a very clear and strict criteria. And one of the criteria is basically that the potential damage is lower than what you have to invest in protection. So, for example, let's say that there is a high risk, and that let's say the potential damage of this risk is, let's say, $10,000. Okay. Now, if you calculate that the implementation of safeguards or controls to manage this risk would cost, let's say, $40,000, so 4 times more, then you could say, look, we are not going to treat this risk because it doesn't make sense, right? We have to invest 40K to resolve a potential problem of a 10K. It doesn't make sense, okay? In this kind of a case, you simply say, we accept this risk, okay? Because it makes sense from the business point of view. Another, let's say, scenario could be that you accept the risks because you currently do not have the budget for it. Let's say that you are planning your budget, that you already planned your budget for 2025, and that you can't really invest more into security. So because of your budget limitations, then you say, we are accepting this risk temporarily, okay? But in, let's say, next year, 2026, we actually we are going to actually implement this risk, so with a delay. So this is also, I would say, a valid scenario for accepting risk. Okay, another method for treating the risk is avoiding the risk. And this is basically where you actually start doing your business operations in a different way, so that risk simply doesn't exist anymore. For example, let's say that a company which is highly regulated and it has a very high risk profile. Let's say that the company assessed that there are high risks, unacceptable risks, because people are using their private devices for working. Let's say that they're using their private smartphones for work, and this actually introduces very, very high risks. And then the company can simply say, okay, we're not simply allowing anymore the usage of private devices. From now on, we will purchase you official, company smartphones, and then you can use those. So basically, this is not, applying a control. This is simply a way to avoid the risk. You basically change the way how you're doing things. In this case, you're using different types of devices, and this is how you avoid the risks. In some cases, you might have, I don't know, high risks because, you have remote workers. And in this case, the company might say, okay, no more remote working. From now on, you have to work only from within your company offices. Again, this would be the way to avoid the risk. And then the fourth way is to transfer the risks. So basically, this is where you actually transfer a part, I would say, of your damage towards the third party. And typical example here would be an insurance policy from an insurance company. So for example, for, I don't know, physical assets, you can insure your physical assets against, for example, fire or earthquake. So if your physical server goes on fire, then you will get some money from the insurance company. So this is the way to transfer the risk to an insurance company. Okay, so these are again the four typical most common ways to treat the risks, and yeah, out of these four, the most common one is the applying the appropriate controls. And by the way, what I didn't mention before, you know, all of the things that I mentioned today in this webinar is aligned with not only with ISO 27005, the standard which is focused on risk management, but also with ISO 31000, which is the standards that describes how you manage overall risks on the corporate level. So it's basically enterprise risk management. Good. Now let's move on to the conclusion, and then I'll have some time also for to answer your remaining questions. So I would say, you know, if you focus on these mandatory elements of risk assessment and treatment only, you know, without trying to push some unnecessary things, you know, that are not really needed, then you can really complete this phase of risk assessment and treatment in some, I would say, reasonable time. And I'm not saying that you have to do it too quick, so that you have to do this thoroughly. But also what you have to realize is that if you want to be successful with ISO 27001 with you know, information security, then you can't expect your risk assessment to be perfect. Because if you want it to be perfect, then it will last, you know, years only doing this risk assessment, and you know, in theory you can't really ever list all of your risks, right? So you have to stop somewhere, and ISO 27001 basically tells you that you have to review your risk assessment on a periodic basis. So the risks that you didn't identify initially, you will actually be able to add them on later, and you will be able to improve your risk assessment continuously. And this is the whole idea here. You know, do, I would say, a reasonable amount of effort to assess the risks. Don't try to overextend it, because it's going to become too lengthy, and you will simply lose focus and I would say the interest of all the stakeholders. Finish your project, and then in the maintenance phase of your ISMS, then you can actually improve your risk assessment continuously. And of course, you can use a tool like Conformio to speed things up, you know, with these catalogs of threats, vulnerabilities, controls, and so on. And we'll also send you now the meeting link with our Conformio expert. So if you want to, you know, have a short demo on how Conformio works, then you can schedule a call and, you know, simply discuss this in more detail with our colleague. And again, if you want to do it completely on your own, you can use the link that we already sent you, and you can test it out in this free trial period. Good. Now let's move on to the Q&A session. I'll start answering your remaining questions now, and of course feel free to send any more questions through the chat. I'll gladly answer them. Before I start answering the questions, just a couple of announcements here. So first of all, you know, feel free to reach out to me directly and ask any question, I would say offline. So you can use this email address that we'll send you now through this chat window. Second, you can follow me on LinkedIn and YouTube. On LinkedIn, I paste usually the latest news I find on the internet regarding security governance, so cybersecurity governance. So if you want to see, you know, kind of latest article on the governance, you can take a look at my LinkedIn profile. And I also publish on LinkedIn the most, let's say, the most useful stuff from 𝗏𝗏𝗴𝗏𝗏 website. On YouTube, I have lots of videos there, a couple of hundred videos, and they're around ISO 27001, around NIS2, and lately about DORA. So if you're interested in, let's say, learning through videos, then you can take a look at my YouTube and LinkedIn profile. Okay, another announcement here is that my next webinar next Wednesday will be about the basics of NIS2 and also what are the steps to comply with this EU cybersecurity directive. And we'll send you also now the links where you can sign up for this and some other webinars. So you'll see links to sign up either on Advisor website or LinkedIn on YouTube. In any case, you can watch the next webinar, sign up for the next webinar in any of these channels. Good, so now let me go through the questions I received before the webinar, and then I'll end with the questions I received during the webinar. So Chokri was asking, do we have to follow ISO 27005 standard to carry out the risk assessment? The answer is no. 27005 is not mandatory. You could use some methods from there, but it's not required. The same person is asking, is the cyber risk part included in 27001 or should we refer to ISO 27032 or NIST? So 27001, basically the official name of ISO 27001 is that this is a cybersecurity standard. So if you go and take a look at the name of the standard, it actually says this is about cybersecurity. So yes, cybersecurity is included in 27001. Because it covers, amongst other things, it covers the controls that are related, for protecting against cybersecurity threats and also for protecting various digital assets. Okay, Caroline was asking, under which conditions do you recommend additional SOC 2 certification? Well, SOC 2 is kind of similar to 27001, so I would say that the primary driver for SOC 2 would be business, right? If you have clients who demand SOC 2 certification, by all means, go for SOC 2 because this will bring you more money. So from the business point of view, it does make sense. Okay, Dev was asking, what are the types of risk assessment practices and its applicability to risk industries? So basically, you always need to have these 5 elements that I explained through the webinar. And this is, the same method, the same approach is applicable, whatever, if you are in a retail business or if you're, high-tech manufacturing or if you're in a software business. All these principles apply to any of these industries, so you do not need to, make some adjustments to them. Chris was asking, will insider risk management be included in this webinar? So I did not mention specifically insider risk management, but basically it's... when you do the risk assessment, you also have to take into account the risks of insiders. And if you do this asset-based risk assessment, it's actually quite easy to do so, because let's say that you have some, particular, let's say, folder with some very sensitive files, and you also have to take into account that you have an insider who might pose a threat to these files. So when you use this asset-based risk assessment, it's actually very easy to very easy. It's methodologically available or easy to actually, find out all the different types of threats for any of the assets that you have. Sarah was asking, which one is better, asset-based or process-based risk assessment? I wouldn't say that, which one is better. It's really a matter of a preference. My preference is, again, this asset-based, not only because of 27001, but primarily because we also deal with clients from for DORA and for NIS2, and then again, asset-based is there a dominant one. Antonio is asking, is it possible to integrate asset-based risk analysis with process-based risk analysis? Yes, I've seen some companies that are doing process-based first, just to kind of assess the risks on a high level. And then once they did this high-level assessment, then they use the asset-based for more detailed risk assessment. So it could be an approach. Sana is asking, NIS2 requires some IT companies to determine their risk appetite and risk tolerance. How ISO 27001 can help them with these? So again, 27001 defines that you need to define the acceptable level of risk. And basically, this is exactly the same thing as risk appetite or risk tolerance. Only different words for the same thing. Roger was asking, how can you use ISO 27005 and 1 and 5 for risk management in NIS2? Well, the thing is, NIS2 does not really specify the details on how you have to perform the risk assessment and treatment. So you can actually use exactly the things that I've mentioned today in this webinar also for NIS2. There is also this, for NIS2, you have this Commission implementing regulation, but also it doesn't specify anything that we didn't also, that I didn't already mention here in this webinar today. 𝗨𝗲𝗴𝗶𝗀𝗏 was asking how can the organization assess the SaaS applications? Again, using this asset-based approach. So let's say that you are using, I don't know, Gmail as a SaaS application, and then the asset here would be, you know, Gmail. The threats would be, let's say, unauthorized access, and you know, the vulnerability could be that you're not using multi-factor authentication. So again, these principles of asset-based risk assessment are also very, I would say, useful when it comes to SaaS applications. Asad was asking, what are the mandatory requirements that organizations need to implement ISO 27001 and the core principles of information security, along with the steps involved during the implementation of 27001? Yeah, okay, so this is definitely not the webinar to answer this question in detail. So, but we'll send you a link to an article which explains, you know, the most important steps you have to take as part of ISO 27001. So my colleague will send now this link. It's called ISO 27001 Guide, and then you will have these all of these steps for 27001 implementation. So you can you know, open this article and take a look. Okay, we are on the top of the hour now. I still have something like 10 or so questions to answer. So if you can stick around for maybe 5 minutes more, then just to hear the answers to all these, you're welcome to do so. So Mark is asking, do you have to prove that you don't have a threat, like you have UPS, so there is no electricity outage threat? Basically, you should list these kind of threats, but then you could actually assess the likelihood of this kind of risk as low. Now, likelihood will be low because you already have this control, okay, which actually decreases the risk, okay, or in this case, it decreases the likelihood, right? So even if you do have a control in place, you should list this risk just to actually kind of acknowledge that this control already decreased this risk. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is asking, is it good to add an option to set the residual risk manually? If you want to do it, of course, why not? This is something that you could do. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is asking, are the impact and likelihood selected by us? Definitely yes. So this cannot be done automatically by anyone or anything. So Conformio is not selecting impact and likelihood automatically, because this depends highly, you know, on your level, on your risk profile. So let's say, I know, a smaller company which deals, I don't know, with, you know, I don't know, vegetables, you know, would have a very different risk assessment for, I don't know, their whatever systems they're using from, I don't know, a big company like IBM. So this is something that has to be done by human from a particular company. This cannot be done automatically. Sorin is asking, to maintain compliance with the standard, is it necessary to re-evaluate the initially identified risk periodically, or can the risk register be made of new risks on each assessment cycle? So basically you are assessing, so let's say that you initially assess the risks in, let's say, March 2025, you went for a certification, let's say, I don't know, June 2025, and then once you're reassessing these risks once you want to review these risks in, let's say, November 2025, you're assessing, you're reviewing all the existing risks, okay? And you might actually adjust the level of impact and likelihood there, but you're also adding some new risks that you didn't have before. So you're basically starting from your existing old risk assessment and improving it and adding some risks if needed. 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 is asking, do you other training for risk management for ISO 9001? I'm not sure if my colleague has a webinar on ISO 9001, but there are some articles on 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 website on ISO 9001 risk management. So if you Google 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 ISO 9001 risk management, you'll find a couple of materials there. These asking, is applying appropriate control treatment the same as mitigation? Well, basically mitigation is equal to risk treatment. Controls, applying controls is one method of mitigation. So risk mitigation is basically equal in the terminology as a risk treatment. Kowami is asking, does ISO 27000 recommend using AI for risk assessment? No, it doesn't. It actually doesn't mention artificial intelligence at all. So it's not something that you would actually have. And by the way, we published very recently, my colleague published on our website an article which speaks about how you can actually, which controls to use actually to decrease risks of artificial intelligence. I know this is not related to this question, but just occurred to me. So you can actually Google also and see this article, what are the most appropriate controls for AI. Okay, and final question today, Ilko, may risk assessment in ISO 27001 be used for GDPR? So GDPR in itself has, I would say, two major parts, right? One major part is about privacy, and for that purpose 27000 risk assessment is not really useful because you have to do this data protection impact assessment, so it's different, I would say, in approach and let's say method than what you have in 27001. However, there is also this part of actually protecting this personal data in GDPR. This is Article 32, and for that part, ISO 27001 in general and specifically risk assessment is very useful. So again, if you view GDPR from, let's say, these two bigger kind of parts, one is this legal privacy part and the other one is security part. Yes, for security part, 27001 in general is very good, and as part of this is also risk assessment is very good for this security part. Good. Basically, this is it for the Q&A. So let me just wrap up just a couple of words to wrap up the webinar. So as I mentioned, in this 1 hour webinar was too short to go through every possible detail of let's say assets and threats and vulnerabilities and these kind of things, and for that purpose you can take a look at other materials that we have, and of course you can use Conformia to play around with these risks. And yeah, we'll publish the PDF presentation deck together with all the links from today's webinar on the same page where you're watching the webinar now, if you joined through LinkedIn and through YouTube. So you should simply leave the page where you joined this webinar for maybe 10 minutes, and then you will see in the comments section, you will see this link for downloading the PDF presentation deck, and you'll also see all of these links summarized. And by the way, in the LinkedIn, you will see actually that these links will also be clickable because the webinar will be finished. Okay, so just stay on the same page for 10 minutes if you joined through LinkedIn or through YouTube. If you joined through Advisor website, through Zoom, then we will send you an email with all of these links and also with the link to download the PDF presentation deck, and we will send you this in a couple of hours or latest by tomorrow. Okay, and finally I will send you a short survey now, and it's a very short, it's only 3 questions, so I would really appreciate if you spend less than a minute to fill it out and just to give me feedback on how you like this webinar. And this would be all. Thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. Have a nice day.